All aboard at the hyperfixation station. My name is Quinlan, and I put this video off for way too long. I was going to put it in my other merge video, which I'll link probably, maybe, probably not, but it got really long. So what this one's going to be about is the way that the merge has been affecting Oscar and Ozpin as individuals and together, as well as the differences between them and how they're like-minded souls but not the same-minded. And now there is one day left. It is Friday before the finale, and I still think that it's likely that the merge is going to finalize tomorrow. It's not as likely as it was before because there hasn't really been any build up to it in the last few episodes. Like, yes, you know, there have been signs like the way that they're standing or the facial expressions that they're doing, but it hasn't really been addressed. Like, none of the identifying stuff or the memories have really been at the forefront of the plot, which is understandable. So it's possible that that won't happen, but I do think, or at least I hope, that some things about the merge will at least be clarified, if not finalized. So I want to make a video discussing the differences between Oscar and Ozpin, as well as the similarities, and how the merge has been affecting them as a pair and individually. So I've narrowed it down to two categories of merge effects: superficial and substantial. Superficial category includes things like the voice, word choices, speech patterns, fighting style or abilities, poses, mannerisms, facial expressions, and the ease of switching between the two. Substantial category includes things like worldview, morals, relationship to the other characters, how they approach situations, and working together. Overall, what I have noticed is that most of the changes that Ozpin has gone through fit in the substantial category, whereas most of the changes that Oscar has gone through fit in the superficial category. And when I say that, I mean specifically regarding the merge. He has gone through significant changes throughout his time in the series. I don't think anyone can argue that. Now, Oscar as an individual outside of Ozpin does develop along with the other characters. They've all grown and changed, but with Oscar it can be hard to determine which changes are due to his own development versus which changes are due to merging with Oz. So let's try to figure that out anyway. First, the main reason that people have difficulty differentiating these is because we didn't really get to see a lot of clear establishment of Oscar's character early on. We never got to know him before Oz, and we never really got to focus on what makes him him. But those things are there, it's just not at the forefront so that a lot of people notice. It's just that I am obsessed with them at the moment because I have ADHD and I hyperfixate. So let's use the magic of hindsight to analyze Oscar's character as an individual. Someone in a Ruby review that I watched, I'll put the name of who it was at the bottom of the screen if I find it, complimented the positions of the team members in the Schnee dining room in chapter 11, saying that it made sense for each of their characters. And they said, of course, contemplative Oscar is looking out the window lost in thought. Of course, he was in a very Ozpin-y pose, which makes sense. Although I will say, side note, that is a pose that Oscar used to do all the time and has kind of done a lot. It's just that he used to do it in a very awkward kind of hands behind the back way, and now it's like a confident stance, which I think is an interesting little shift, is that he already had a lot of similar mannerisms. It's just that they have such a different vibe now because they have the confidence and the merging. Now, people don't often acknowledge Oscar's own personality. They often say that he had no identifying traits prior to Volume 7, and there's some merit to the argument that his characterization wasn't made clear enough early on. So the mention of Oscar being a contemplative person stuck with me as something that someone actually noticed, especially because of how much I agree with that assessment of his character, and looking back at it, it strikes me that he always has been. That this is a major defining aspect of his personality that has been consistent, realistic, and actually well done throughout his time in the series. I made a post to kind of sum it up before we get into it so that you get the general idea of what we're going through. It says, Oscar Pine at least once in any given volume. You know, insert introspection regarding his feelings about the current situation. It's strange. Insert musing about the philosophical implications and nature of the situation. But insert his takeaway from the situation and then takes action that supports what he said. Say what you will about the introduction of his character, but this has been pretty consistent and is legitimately good writing whenever we get to see it. It's just that we didn't often get to see it. Or at least it wasn't given the focus that it would have needed in order for people to actually have that connection with the character if they weren't invested. Even all the way back in Volume 4, when he only had a couple of scenes, he was pensive about his feelings, his future, and his situation, speaking to Oz about the complex and conflicting thoughts and feelings that he's experiencing. In Kuroyuri, he says, "You know, the weirdest part is how it feels. Everything you've told me is completely crazy, but it doesn't feel crazy anymore. It feels like I'm doing the right thing." Oz says, "Well, I suppose that's good." And Oscar says, "No, it's scary." He's already questioning the nature of his own sanity and identity and this adventure, but he's making the decision to move forward anyway. He's also always been very open about his feelings and his fears, which, you know, makes sense that his theme song is the song Fear, which is the Volume 7 credits. Not to mention the new merch that just came out, the DIIIIIIIE merch. Oscar's description is "Conquer your fears." In Volume 5, we get the dojo scene, where he opens up with complete transparency. He says, "I'm scared. I'm more scared than I've ever been in my life, than I ever thought was possible. I always knew I wanted to be more than a farmhand, but this? Who would ask for this?" And he even cries, and he doesn't try to hide it. Even after Ruby leaves, he continues to ponder their situation with Ozpin, noting how hard this clearly is for Ruby, too. In that scene, he also muses about his feelings towards the cane, the long memory, saying, "It's strange. I've only had this cane for a few weeks, but I feel like I've had it for a lifetime. Longer, even." His very first line of Volume 6 is interesting because it seems like Volume 6 is around the time that they wanted to start showing the effects of the merge in little ways, especially in the first chapter. They had both Oscar and Oz make similar faces to one another, and Oscar's very first line is something that I could easily imagine either Oscar or Ozpin saying. He said, "You know, sometimes the burden of saving the world feels overwhelming. But then people like that come along and make me grateful that it's our job and not theirs." He just casually slips into conversation that this is something he thinks about often, the burden of saving the world and how overwhelming it is, and yet he's just going along with it. He's completely overwhelmed, but he deals with those feelings thanks in part to what he learned from Ruby, and in part thanks to his own commitment to helping the world. Then, of course, there's the iconic and profoundly sad line, "I'm just going to be another one of his lives, aren't I?" There was no hiding it or sugarcoating it, just worrying about the existential nature of his own identity and future, and sharing those worries as they are. When he comes back after going missing, he addresses the team, the same team that yelled at, attacked, and or ignored him all volume with the exception of Ruby and sort of Blake. He addresses them with sincerity, confiding in them his thoughts of the inevitability of his situation and the finite nature of his sense of self, which is a lot for a 14-year-old. He says, "These past few weeks, I've been worried about the same things you were. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be me. But I did some thinking, and I do know that I want to do everything I can to help with whatever time I have left." Unfortunately, we didn't get to see what Oscar did while missing, but apparently much of it was spent contemplating all of this on his own, lost in thought. He came to the conclusion that he might be gone at any moment, and would therefore use every moment he has. It wasn't until Volume 7 that it became more of a focal point, especially in his foil to Ironwood, and the foil has continued into Volume 8. There's a huge frickin' direct parallel. There's many direct parallels, but frickin' look at this one. Look at that! That scene is a direct parallel, and I think that that means that Ironwood might get shot or knocked off the edge of the ledge as well, because Ironwood has taken Oscar's point, and that scene in Winter has taken Ironwood, so he might fall. Imagine he falls through the same hole that Oscar blasted after he shot Oscar down Atlas. When Ironwood tells Oscar, "It was your idea to use the staff to lift Atlas," Oscar takes that in, saying, "Feels strange, knowing that part of me helped come up with all this." So he acknowledges that Oz's former lives are indeed a part of him, and that's something he's working towards coming to terms with. Ironwood then pushes a bit too far, replying, "You'll get used to it, I'm sure. Eventually, you won't even know who's who anymore." Which is a line that the fandom has kind of realized is about us. In Chapter 12, I actually thought that this was Oscar, based on the facial expressions and the voice and the way he was talking, but that was Ozpin, just looking a lot like Oscar. I mean, listen to this. Listen to the way he says Staff of Creation. He says it the same way both times.
The Staff of Creation. The Staff of Creation.
It wasn't until I realized that this was the same scene that ended chapter 11 that I was like, wait, when did they have time to switch? And then chapter 13 showed that, oh, they didn't switch. A cat has just climbed atop my shoulders. You having fun, buddy? But when Ironwood says this, Oscar's face falls and he looks down. Says, right. He then gives James some advice about the path that he's heading down and reassures him that it's okay to be afraid. You just can't let that fear control you. There's more that he says in this speech that is a very good indicator of his differences and similarities to Ozpin, but I'll get to that one after this because I don't want to go on a million tangents. But I will say, I just said I won't go on tangents, but now I have a tangent. I'd like to note something that I think is going to be very important in Oscar's general arc, especially because of how big of a point it has been throughout Volume 8, is that Ironwood said it was your idea, and Oscar corrected, a part of me, and it's only a part of you, don't forget about the rest, has been a running theme in Volume 8. Okay, end of tangent. After Oscar reassures him that it's okay to be afraid and you can't let that fear control you, his expression is that of someone who's struggled to accept this lesson himself and has overcome the fears that could have warped who he is. The fear doesn't go away, but he's learned that you have to live alongside your fears. Old Jimmy Boy then asks, "Do you believe in me?" Oscar thinks for a moment before responding, "I do believe in you, but not only you," and then advises him to be upfront with the people who can help him in spite of the risk that it takes to trust. Oscar's one of those rare characters in media who doesn't just talk the talk but walks the walk. His advice to Ironwood doesn't ring hollow for us because we see how he's learned it for himself, and his actions show it, time and again. He shows that he understands and empathizes with others throughout the volume. When Ruby decides that Oscar was right to want to tell Ironwood the truth and confronts him about it, Oscar says, "He's finally choosing the truth over fear. We should do the same." That addresses both Ironwood and Ruby's uncertainties about telling the truth in a way that isn't dismissive or acting as though anyone was inherently in the right or wrong, that they just had different feelings about how to proceed, and rather that the choice to trust is a difficult and admirable one. Oscar's speech to Ironwood in the Volume 7 finale showcases a lot of Oscar's qualities, but I won't go into those tangents right now. I'll just narrow down and then talk about it later. He again examines the cane, saying, "I guess it's because of Oz, but holding it helps calm me down when I'm afraid." Yet again, just completely open about what he's thinking and feeling all the time. Ironwood says, "You still think I'm afraid. We all are. It's what we do in our fear that reveals..." And he gets cut off, but Ozpin picks up where he left off in his monologue, which is essentially a summary of the philosophies that he learned from Oscar during the volume. It's essentially the embodiment of that meme where it's like, hey, can I copy your homework? Sure, but just change it enough so that the teacher doesn't notice. That's what Ozpin's speech or monologue was in Volume 7. It was just copying everything Oscar said in the volume. Which makes sense because the Kruby commentary said that it was Oscar's words of wisdom that managed to reach Ozpin and change his worldviews. Even Ironwood comments on how philosophical Oscar is during their argument. He even uses that word, and that's a point where I realized, yeah, he is. He is constantly he's a little philosophy boy. Oscar's consideration of complicated ethics is a key part of who he is, and that's been demonstrated time and again since Volume 5 with Hazel, where he differed with Ozpin. Volume 8 has given us a couple great scenes for some insight regarding Oscar's feelings, the first of which is in Chapter 2. Seeing all of the infighting and discord among the refugees, Oscar becomes discouraged and says, "It should not be this hard getting people to just cooperate." And that's a sentiment he still seems to be feeling right now as his team reacts to Emerald and Ozpin being back, and it echoes his ethical philosophy-focused rhetoric from Volume 7. And how firmly he believes in giving Emerald and Ozpin a second chance, or infinitely more chances. This is the same as how he gave Hazel another chance in Volume 5 and again in Volume 8. And with Ironwood in Volume 7, multiple times. Just, he's 3 for 4 on those. The 4th time didn't go as well. But back to Chapter 2, he says, "I started to feel like me. Not the same me I was before all of this, but the me I always wanted to be." And gosh, this poor little kid, he puts so much value on individualism and asserts that the person you will become will be by your own doing. He talks about the path that Ironwood is heading down and the choices that we make and the way that they can affect who we are and who we become. It's what we do in our fear that reveals who we are. But he feels helpless in maintaining his own. That he is the exception to the rule and cannot choose who he will become. All he can do is choose who to be right now. Of course, I don't believe that that is wholly true. I believe that, well, you can watch my merge video if you want to see what I believe happens with the merge. But essentially, the souls become whomever they identify as post-merge, and that is partially up to the souls in question. Maybe not as like a, decision to be one or the other, because it is a fusion. Both of them will affect one another. Their souls are becoming one. But it's up to every person what their soul becomes. And that includes the Ozcarnations. And then we get the girl who fell through the world scene, which is such a simple scene, but it might be one of my favorite RWBY scenes just ever because of how well written it is, how much depth it gives to Oscar's character that we really didn't have a lot of previously. Not that he didn't have character depth, but this is establishing who he was before Ozpin. He recounts one of his favorite fairy tales from childhood, reanalyzing it now that he's gained more experience and perspective, and expresses a greater understanding of the tale. He says, "I thought the idea of falling through Remnant into a new world was exciting. I never understood why she was so sad when she finally made it back home. But now it makes more sense. Oz says she wasn't the same girl anymore. Yeah." So this implies that he thought about literature through kind of an analytical lens even as a child, and this curious contemplative nature has always been a part of him. Maybe he didn't want to be like the heroes in the books like RWBY did, but he definitely wanted adventure. And now that he has it, he sees just how hard it is and how much you've changed. Because it's true, Oscar isn't the same little farm boy that he once was. He has developed and come a long way. And he's come into his own, and I really love to see that. He consistently allows himself to be vulnerable with everyone he meets, be it Ruby, Emerald, Hazel, Jean, and the whole group right after being attacked by them. He is just so willing to be open with people despite the risk that it takes to trust. Another good quality of his is how strategic he is. I mean, he figures out how to fight Cordovan's mech. He talks about turning Salem's forces against her and is successful. He talks to Ironwood where he says, "The panic you were worried about, it's already happening. The secrets you're keeping, they're about to be in the open anyway. It's time." And then even with Emerald in the tunnels, giving her a second chance, and no matter how this fight ends, we could really use someone like you. So yeah, that's a nice little overview of the insight we've gotten to Oscar's personality. He is a compassionate, introspective, optimistic kind of person, but he's also very realistic and philosophical and ethical and moral, existential. He has all these crises. And honestly, I like to think that if Blake were to give him a word, like she does, which I know it's oversimplifying to give a person just one word, but I like to think it would be resilience. No matter what knocks him down, he keeps coming back. And he keeps growing and changing from every experience and learning from it, and we get to see that. And no matter what knocks him down, he doesn't lose that open-minded, earnest, hopeful, considerate personality that he has. He doesn't lose these things that make him who he is, but he learns from the mistakes and moves forward from them. And I think that's just really good quality for a kid to have. And of course, all the memories that you're going to get will affect those thoughts and the things that you can learn, because he's not just learning from his lifetime, he is learning from hundreds of past ones, which makes me think that he is not going to make the same mistakes that Ozpin did, or the King of Vale, or any previous reincarnation. He's going to learn from and move forward. And when you're a contemplative little wise child who likes to think about the nature of existence all the time, if you suddenly get a bunch of memories of thousands of years of lifetimes, you're going to think about those and reminisce and try to pick it apart and understand some greater understanding of the universe. And that is kind of what we see happen with him. Volume 7 is when I first started realizing how different and how similar Oscar and Ozpin really are. It's the volume where a lot of people, especially in chapters 7 and 9 and 13, those are the main ones where people are saying, look how much he's becoming like Ozpin, he's so wise now. But the wisdom, even though the rhetoric that he shares is said in a similar way, the things that he's actually saying and the substance is very different. Oscar's wisdom is unique to him, and he is growing alongside these memories and alongside his own experiences. Like I mentioned earlier, if you listen to Ozpin's speech at the end of Volume 7, which is the first time we've heard from him since early Volume 6, which is prior to the exploration and development of Oscar as an individual and his growth. If you look more closely at Ozpin's speech, you can trace back pretty much every line of it to something that Oscar has said or asserted or believes. You still think I'm afraid. We all are. And then the single quality that is common across every living creature on this planet is fear. You just can't let that fear control you. It's funny then that as common as fear is, we so easily underestimate its power. Some things matter more, I think. Keeping our humanity, it's what makes us different from her. Will you even recognize them? I think the best thing you could do is sit down and talk with the people you're most afraid to. And as more people depend on you, those fears can take on greater power. It's okay to be afraid. But fear itself isn't worthy of concern. It's what we do in our fear that reveals it is who we become while in its clutches. I mean, he's just copied Oscar's homework. And like I mentioned a moment ago, the Kruby commentary said that it's Oscar's advice to Ironwood that changed Ozpin's perspective on trust, fear, and secrecy and compelled him to return. I mean, of course, falling out of the sky and trying to save your reincarnation is why he returned, but the reason that he was staying back this time, because Oscar also got shot out of the sky in Volume 6 finale, but he left again. This time, because of Oscar, he's stayed. Oscar understands that fear is the enemy of trust in a way that until now Ozpin didn't. Fear is an inevitability, but trust is a choice. That's the lesson that Oscar taught him during Volume 7. Oscar asserts that the greater good, no matter the cost, isn't truly great or good. He's able to see that when you use the big picture as an excuse to ignore smaller injustices, you've already lost. And this is all used in his foil to Ironwood, but Ozpin was listening. Saving humanity to Ozpin and Ironwood was about uniting the entire world as a monolith. But to Oscar, it's about preserving and nurturing the humanity within every single person, bringing it back to the people who've lost it. The smaller picture shouldn't be ignored for the sake of the end goal, because their goal is only achieved through individuals choosing to unite. Every small piece needs to be in place for a puzzle to be completed. One of the substantial changes that Ozpin has gone through is notable now in Volume 8, and it's also something that highlights a difference between the two, that Oz has kind of grown to meet Oscar where he is. Listen to how Ozpin talks to Hazel in Volume 8 compared to how Oscar spoke to Hazel in Volume 5. Oscar asked why Hazel hated them, and after Hazel and Ozpin explained what happened, Oscar tried to reason with Hazel about his motives. Ozpin tried to dissuade him from doing so because he said, "I know Hazel, he's wounded in a way that cannot be healed," and begged Oscar to let him just fight. But Oscar held firm, wanting to stay in control and extending a chance to Hazel. He asked if his sister knew the risk when she decided to become a huntress. And then he passionately expressed that Hazel's sister made a noble choice to put others before herself, which validated his sister and honors her death, while explaining why Hazel's motives are misguided. He gave the agency back to Gretchen, the agency that Hazel had stripped and applied to Ozpin, which is something that I think is also a parallel or reference to Pyrrha, and how people often say, oh, it was Ozpin who killed her. It's like, no, it was Cinder who killed her. It was Salem who orchestrated her death. And saying that Ozpin did it, or taking all of that, everything that happened, and just pinning it on Ozpin, even though, yes, he should have told the truth. Yes, there's all of that. It's complicated. But what that does when that's the conversation is it takes all of Pyrrha's agency away. Her life was her own, and her death was her own. And I think that's something that's important, and Oscar's pretty much the only character who has ever said something like that, something that gives the agency back to someone when a grudge strips them of it. Because Oscar believes in the value of choice, which is a value that Ozpin also believes, but the difference is that Oscar understands that a choice without all the information isn't really a whole choice. Ozpin then took over anyway and fought Hazel, which, I can understand that it's like he was... he could have died. It would make sense. Oscar didn't really stand a chance against Hazel, but the principle of taking over against his will and overriding his volition is something that is a little bit questionable, but he's learned from that. He's not doing that anymore. throughout Volume 8, he is constantly asking Oscar, being kind, and then, like, you can tell it pains him. He wants so badly to take over and take the torture for himself, but he is respecting Oscar's choice to be the one in control when the torture happens, until Oscar decides to work with him and then they switch. But that's later. But now in Volume 8, Ozpin is asking Hazel questions about his motives, speaking passionately, coming from a place of understanding and empathy, which is a stark contrast to the anger he exhibited towards Hazel while fighting in Volume 5, appealing to his humanity, believing he still has the capacity for change, which he used to not believe, and using logic to try and help him see the hypocrisy and dangers of the path that he's on, a path that he can choose to depart from. The last part is also reminiscent of Oscar warning Ironwood that the path he's on isn't going to take him anywhere good. Ozpin even begins to reveal the truth about the relics to Hazel, which I doubt he would have done without Oscar's plan to help turn the villains. He even tells him about the lost fable. All of these values, qualities, choices, and perspectives are far more similar to Oscar's worldviews than to Professor Ozpin's when he was alive. But now he's changing. They are learning from each other. He is learning from Oscar. Back in 5, Ozpin told Oscar Hazel is wounded in a way that cannot be healed. Now, because of Oscar, Ozpin is trying to help Hazel heal. That is a pretty significant change. In Chapter 7, while Ozpin is trying to get through to Hazel and failing, Oscar asks to take control. Ozpin hesitates, not wanting him to get hurt even more, but Oscar cuts him off with, "You want him to trust us? Then trust me." And then he does. Ozpin makes the conscious decision to trust in Oscar, who in turn makes the decision to trust in Hazel. The last time that Oscar revealed Jin's name for someone to find out the truth, Ozpin fought back. He tried to keep control and suppress Oscar from telling them out of fear. This time, Ozpin let him, choosing to trust instead. I think it's really interesting and probably not a coincidence that the 2 times that Ozpin fought Oscar for control of his body against his will were to protect him from Hazel and to keep him from revealing information about the lamp and revealing Jin's name. This time, Oscar was allowed to take over despite Hazel being right there punching him and revealing Jin's name, and he wasn't even stopped from it. Ozpin didn't even know what his plan was, but he gave the trust to Oscar. And it paid off. It worked. It's really neat seeing Oscar grow into his role as the next protector of Remnant as himself. Again, you know my opinion on the merge if you've seen my merge video, but like Ozpin said, I am changed, but my memories stay with me. And in Volume 8, Oscar is the one calling the shots now and taking the lead, teaching and changing Ozpin in his own way. He is being the change. Volume 8 has done such a cool job where how they're showing the progression of the merge in subtle ways and not so subtle ways, and it blows me away that they managed to make Oscar still feel like Oscar to us, while also showing the growing similarities to Oz. Because it doesn't feel like those qualities are being tacked on to Oscar or stuffed into him. They feel organic, like a natural progression of his own character. He's inheriting the soul, but he's making it his own. It's less like either of them have qualities that are just being added to each other, and more that the like-minded souls aspect means that they're just bringing out qualities in one another that were already there. For instance, that conversation with him explaining the cane felt very similar to the way that Ozpin would address the group back in Volume 5 or 6, and it also seems to kind of parallel Ozpin talking with the rest of the inner circle, the Ozluminati. And like, if you look back at the scene explaining the lamp, or the scene where he explains the birds, like that is very, very similar, and it to the point where when Jean asked, like, that's how you did that, by using all the stored up power, subconsciously I expected Oscar to say, indeed. I didn't know I was expecting it until he didn't say it, and then I'm like, wait. It's just that this scene felt so familiar that I was like, that's the next line. But Oscar does it differently. He's being fully open and honest, outspoken and emotionally driven rather than reserved and calculated. We can see that in the same story beat in the scene with Ozluminati and the scene with Oscar. When Oz points to his head, Oscar has his hands over his heart. He is extending full trust even to Emerald and speaking to them as peers rather than students like Oz did, or like a team he wasn't a part of, like how he used to feel. He's been allowed to speak his mind and be confident and comfortable around his teammates for the past 2 volumes, and it's really nice to see, because that's shown us who he is when he's not too afraid or nervous to express it. And as he's come into his own, we've seen that like-minded souls aspect come into play, but in ways that are unanticipated. So we see the effects of the merge on Oscar in ways that contrast with what Ozpin would have done. Their similarities are growing, and that's being used to highlight their differences even more. So yeah, they're blending together, and they have been for a while. But it's still Oscar. He still feels like Oscar to watch, and the fact that they've been building this up for so long so that it doesn't feel out of nowhere, to the point that I keep seeing people talk about how Oscar hasn't merged at all, or like, oh, that magic didn't merge them at all, which I thought was like clear that it has, that the merge is progressing, but so many people are like, he's the exact same farm boy that he once was. This is stupid that he's saying I can feel us merging faster. He hasn't changed at all. And I'm like, are we watching the same show? But that's good. That's really, really cool. I like that that is what happened because it shows that it feels natural. This is who he is. It feels right. Oscar's little Ozisms make me go like, oh, that reminds me of Oz, or oh, that could be a sign of the merge, but they've never felt out of place for Oscar as a character, and that's really smooth. He's recalling memories of past lives, using longer words, adopting some similar speech patterns, inheriting muscle memory, gaining magic, but isn't losing himself. Oscar's growing and changing and developing, not fading. And these changes are still his. This development belongs to him. You think Ozpin would have given Hazel the password or immediately trusted Emerald? Heck, he wanted to escape the whale. Oscar's the one who decided to turn Salem's forces against her. The way that Oscar handles these situations shows us who he is. And honestly, I don't think I would see any of the other main characters making the plan to turn Salem's forces against her. I can see Ruby trying to like talk Hazel out of it, or Yang taking the hits and then fighting back, or Jean coming up with a strategy for escaping. I can see all these different things, but this is what Oscar would do, and that's really cool. Every step of the way, Oscar has made his growing soul his own, and as Oz's soul merges with his, it's more and more a part of him. But that soul is a part of him now. He's not a part of it. He's the owner of his soul, not a prisoner, and I am loving seeing him take that ownership and step into his role. While reanalyzing previous volumes, Volume 5 is weird to watch. It is weird to watch Ozpin act the way that he does. Like, I watched the scene where he's talking with Ruby about the relics, and just I was so uncomfortable. It was so bizarre. He felt like a character that I forgot had ever existed. Look at him. I'm so uncomfortable. Who are you? But it doesn't feel weird watching Oscar back then. Like when I watch Oscar in Volume 4 or 5 or the first part of Volume 6, like it doesn't feel as strange because it's like, oh, look at his humble beginnings. Look how he started. Look how far he's come, how much he's grown, etc. But with Ozpin, we didn't follow along. Like, he was gone for 2 volumes. He like pieced out and has been learning and merging in the background, whereas Oscar's been growing and developing on screen. Well, on screen is a bit of a nice word. Volume 8 has been on screen. And Volume 7 had some. It's unfortunate that he wasn't allowed to be more part of the team and he kind of just got stapled to Ironwood, but that's par for the course. Going back for a second to the scene where Oscar is explaining the kinetic energy of the cane, we can see in that scene, because he did just use magic. Like, yes, the cane itself, like the kinetic energy, may not have been a blast of magic, but Oscar did use magic to create the green bubble to protect him. This scene is a really good example of the superficial change versus the substantial change. Because as we see, Oscar's adopting some speech patterns and vocabulary, using longer words than he used to, which is also happens in chapter 1 when he talks about what happens if you use the staff. He says that Atlas falls. In chapter 12, when he talks about when he used the staff, he says the city drops. Atlas has enough natural gravity dust to keep it from plummeting immediately, but, well, nobody's going to want to be around when it touches down. See, the speech patterns are similar, some more of the voices. One thing about the superficial changes is the way that their voices are, because the voices have been melding, I think, pretty evenly. Well, not, it's different. It's interesting because it's not like a melding of like Volume 4 and 5 or 6 Oscar's voice with like Beacon Day Ozpin's voice. It's when Ozpin was gone, we got to see Oscar change and develop in a way that there was a YouTube comment that said that Oscar's mature now, but not Ozpin mature, and that hits the nail on the head because it's true. He matured and he grew up in a lot of ways in Volume 7, which is way faster than any 15-year-old should have to grow, but, you know, weird circumstances. but the way that his voice grew throughout that as well. I mean, when in Volume 7, Chapter 3, when everyone got their new outfits, he did get like 4 or 5 inches taller, and his voice started getting a little lower, so I'm assuming, based on how squeaky his voice was in Volume 6 specifically, that was Aaron Dismuke trying to be like, oh, yep, here's puberty. But Ozpin's voice now sounds a lot closer to Oscar's voice in Volume 7. So it's kind of like a melding between Volume 7 Oscar and Ozpin. It's kind of cool. Oh, right, I was talking about that scene with the cane. But yeah, in that scene we see the speech patterns and the vocab words, but he's choosing to stay true to his morals and his relationship with the others. With Oscar, it's softer, more, I can't think of a better word than intimate. With Oscar, it's not just relaying information, it's open discussion with his friends about the situation, and including them in the decision-making. Like when he says, we have to be careful with how we use the rest. He says, we. It still feels like Oscar because it is Oscar, and his character's developing in a way that feels natural. Like, the merge is accelerating, it's happening, but it makes sense. It doesn't feel like he's being taken over. This is who he is, and it feels right. Like, this is who he was meant to be. Everything he's been through, this development, makes sense regardless of the wizard in his brain. Now let's just talk really quick about some of the superficial changes. I already went on a tangent about the voice and the word choice, because they have been growing more similar to one another. One thing that I noticed in Chapter 12 is I've been waiting all volume, ever since Oz came back, I've been waiting for him to pause after the word but, because I don't know if this is an Aaron Dismuke thing or if this is an Oscar specific thing, but Oscar pauses after the word but a lot, especially like if it's like in the middle of a sentence or a clause. So I've been waiting all volume to see if Ozpin would do the trademark Oscar but pause, and in Chapter 12 he did it twice in the same scene. And not just that, they also both did the well with a pause. Like Oscar says, but, well, nobody's going to want to be around when it touches down. And Ozpin says, like Jin, but, well, he's a character. Which, the way that he says well there kind of reminds me of the way that Oscar says well, but, you know, same voice actor, there's like, it's hard to tell, and I think that's really cool too, because they're trying to make it harder and harder to tell. There's another thing that they do in that scene that I mentioned on Tumblr, and someone made a really cool gift set. So thank you to Green Lake Pine Trees for making this gift set of what I pointed out, which is that earlier in the scene, Oscar says, there's something else to consider. And then later in the scene, Ozpin says, there's still James and his bond to consider. Which is just like, nice little subtle. If you want to hear a good example of Ozpin starting to sound more like Oscar, I mean, it really starts in Volume 7 during that monologue. Because, you know, Oscar had just used magic for the first time. He used it once, and then we can listen to Ozpin's monologue. And not only are the things that he's saying, I already went over, sounding a lot more like Oscar, but the way that he's saying them, the way that his voice drops at the end of sentences into like a kind of deeper, softer timbre, the way that Oscar's does, like when Oscar says things like, the me I always wanted to be. Like, to be. I can't do it. But Ozpin does it a lot in that speech. He does that, and he does the putting stress on certain vowels and kind of does something that mimics the Oscar vocal fry. It's just really cool, because it used to be that when Ozpin was in control of Oscar's body, Shannon McCormick would record the lines speaking as Ozpin, and then Aaron Dismuke would copy the way that he sounded, like he would try to imitate that. And now I wonder if they've been kind of doing some of the opposite, like if they've been having Shannon imitate Aaron, like just slightly, and having them get closer and closer to one another. And then Oscar used magic again to land, and Ozpin's like, Oscar, he does like that little sound. And then Volume 8, a lot of people who didn't even notice it until Chapter 9. I noticed it a lot in specifically Chapter 6, but in Chapter 6 and Chapter 2, the conversations that Oscar and Ozpin have, if you pay attention to like the pacing of their sentences and like the words that they're using and the way that they're speaking, it sounds like almost like it's one conversation, like one person. Like they don't sound exactly the same, like they both still are sounding like themselves, but also like each other. It's been really cool this volume seeing Ozpin talk more and more like Oscar does, or at least like Oscar has since Volume 7. Most people didn't notice until Chapter 9, because the girl who fell through the world thing, like if you listen to the way Ozpin talks, just like that, I recognize that. He just sounds so much like softer and and just like less authoritative and just more Oscar-y. It's interesting. Meanwhile, Oscar's become more confident and more authoritative in a lot of ways, but not in a way that's the same as Oz, but like in a gentler, I don't know, it's interesting. It's really cool. Which of course makes me really interested to see if he is going to be the leader of Team Green or Team Vacuo essentially. Because out of the three of them, out of Oscar, Ren, and Emerald, I feel like, yeah, he would be the leader. Which is wild, because, like, if you had told me Oscar would be the leader of a team, especially a team of Ren and frickin' Emerald Sustrai, I don't know if I'd believe you. But this volume is the first volume where I'm like, yeah, he could be a good team leader. Like, not in a way that I would want him to replace, like, Jean or anyone. Like, I don't want Team Orange. I like Team Alpine. Or Arson now. Or Alpine with an E. But I like Arson. Don't take that out of context. Actually, you know what? Do. Screw it. I like Arson. Yeah, it just might be a really interesting role to see him in, because he already kind of is filling that. Like in chapter 13, it cuts from Ruby explaining to her team what's going on, and well, not just her team, but the audience. And then it cuts directly to Oscar leading the three of them, with him explaining what's going on. It's interesting. But back to chapter 9. Ozpin says that I recognize that, and that she wasn't the same girl anymore. Like, just in a way that sounds very similar to Oscar. Like, they sound like they're the same voice, like the way that Oscar's talking, the way that Ozpin's talking. Like, obviously not exactly the same, because they're different voice actors, and they're still different characters. But it's just, they're becoming really similar. It's just really cool. Even, like, when he's like, I think this plan to divide might have run its course. Like, it's just a little Oscar-y. Not having arcane certainly limits the options. No, he doesn't say the, he says the. Which is another thing. It's not having arcane certainly limits the options, so little ways like that, their voices are becoming more and more like one another's, and I think that's really cool. But also, it doesn't sound that different from chapter 1 of volume 8 to now. Like, Oscar, in chapter 1, like, I was stupid to think the general would listen. Every choice I've made is the wrong one. And then, like, what Salem wants is to turn us against each other. Like, those things, they kind of sound similar to how he's talking now. So, there is some merging, but it doesn't sound like that crazy different to volume 8 at the beginning. And we haven't really gotten to hear very much of Ozpin in Oscar's head. Like, we haven't heard a lot of it since he escaped the whale, since using magic. We got, like, thank you, Oscar. And, oh dear, Ambrosius. I think that might be it. We did get him speaking through Oscar, though, and that was like, oh, they have been merged. Like the way that he talked and, like, the little awkward face he made as he was, like, kind of walking up. It reminds me of Volume 5, or the Volume 4 end credits, if you want to go back even further, where Oscar approaches Crow with the, excuse me, because he, like, walks up with his head down and stops and then looks up kind of nervous. And that's, like, the same thing as the, I was recently, and, like, stops and looks up with, like, all nervous. So that's just kind of neat, the way that he talked during that scene. And, like, a lot of the time, when he said and I hope, and he said, it's a risk you can take on me again. And, like, it looked up, and I'm just like, if you didn't tell me, I wouldn't be certain which that is in control. I mean, I guess, like, based on the words, but, like, the voice and the facial expression in that, I can imagine, like, Ruby does this thing where her eyes widen when she looks back up at him and he's saying that. Like, she has, like, this look that goes from, this is a person I don't know if I can trust, to a look of surprise or recognition. And I wonder if she, like me, for a moment, saw Oscar standing before her. But the real crazy stuff is happening now with the facial expressions. They're very passing and fleeting. But if you pay attention during Jin's flashback that she shows to Cinder and Watts and Neo, Ozpin's making so many Oscar faces. Like, here, I have a post that I made comparing faces that Ozpin has made in the second half of Volume 8 compared to Oscar faces that he has made previously. So here's a couple of those images. Side note, but I really love that their dynamic has switched so much that it's like Oscar's the one, like, he's like, all right, old man, you've been gone for 2 volumes. I've been the one in control. You're the sidekick now. You're following me. And Oz is like, fine by me. I trust you more than I trust me at this point. But I really like that scene with the apology where Oscar's like, I really think Ozpin would like to say something. And he's like, I really think implies that he doesn't know that. So it kind of sounds like he's a mom that's just like, I think my child has something to say to you. Sorry. What was that? Sorry. Like, it's just that kind of vibe. When we get into muscle memory, we can see the mannerisms and fighting style and poses. And those are the things that we notice more with Oscar, which is what most people notice while watching, because it's a lot easier to notice, like, oh look, Oscar's standing by the window with his hands behind his back, or oh look, Oscar's standing with the cane like the way that Oz does, which he's been doing both of those since volume 6, but that was kind of harder to catch, I suppose. And like I said, back in volumes like 4, 5, and 6, he was doing similar poses to Oz, just now they're more confident and they have the Oz vibe, but not in a cocky, authoritative, like above kind of way, more of just like a sincere kind of, I don't know, there's just an air about it. It's really cool. It's really cool how they're able to animate this one model so differently to give off such different vibes and yet make them feel more and more similar. But it's really cool because like Ozpin's eyes are so different now, the way that they're animated. They used to be like squintier or harsher edges and like have this kind of almost pentagonal shape, but now they're the big wide baby eyes and you can see the double shines. Thank you again to Green Like Pine Trees for pointing out that with Oscar, you can much more commonly see both of the shinies in his eyes than Ozpin. Not always, because, you know, pretty much any facial expression you make would close your eyes slightly, so a lot of the time you only see one, but the thing is that when Ozpin has both visible, it stands out a lot more. Even in Chapter 6, when he's angry and narrowing his eyes, it's not sharp angles, they're rounded, and you can see both shines in that, which is like, whoa. With the ease of switching, we can see that it's no longer some big ordeal like where Oscar has to take a deep breath beforehand. In Chapter 11, we see like there's a bit of a build-up, but it's really just close his eyes, open them in a soft gold instead of this huge green flash like before. Even just through volume 6, there was even like a lurching, like it looked like he was becoming possessed. But now it's just kind of a blink and his eyes are gold for a second. And then in Chapter 12, it's even faster. It's just mid-conversation without having to be like, oh, let me take over, oh, it's your turn, or here, explain this. It's just, we haven't even told you about him. Who? The spirit and the staff. Like, it just immediately switches from one to the other, and the expression barely changes, the posture barely changes, if at all, and that's just really cool. Another thing about that is a more substantial change is, like I was talking about with relationship to the other characters, that scene stands out to me because it feels weird to watch, like going back and watching Volume 5, like, and seeing the way, and even Volume 6 with the lamp, just seeing the way that he used to address the group versus now, he's talking to them like peers. It's just, he sounds like he's just talking with them, and he is giving them the full information about the relic. He's not hiding anything or lying. He's giving them full disclosure, everything up front, before they even had a plan that he could approve or disapprove of. He entrusted them with the full knowledge, hoping that they would use it well. We see that Oscar can do the cool poke attack now. It's interesting that Oscar still sometimes holds the cane like a baseball bat, because I kind of thought that, like, based on Volume 7, I mean, we don't really get to see Oscar fight much, like almost ever, so it's kind of harder to document the changes with that. But I kind of thought that he was going to grow out of using it like a baseball bat, and he might not, which I kind of am starting to hope that he doesn't. Because, like, I mean, he does use it the one-handedly, or he might become, like, more ambidextrous and stuff like that, like Oz style, which we have already seen been happening a little bit. But it would be cool if he also uses the baseball bat style in certain times, like when he just whacks with it, because it's fun. Plus it gives him a little bit of character that, you know, Oz never used it like that, so it's kind of like, hey, he's got his own fighting style just a little bit. That might go away, but now that it's stayed for so long, I'm like, I hope that stays. On the subject of fighting style, we saw Oscar spar with Ruby, which, adorable. And then we saw him fight Lionheart, which was mostly just whacking with the baseball bat cane. He did some cool little, like, tossing the cane and catching it and stuff, but it was mostly just whack. And the next time we fight is the first chapter of Volume 6, in which he fights a manticore, which he rides, by the way, so throwback to him riding a manticore and then now riding on Winter's manticore summon. But in that one, a lot of people thought that it was Oz in control because he does like this cool spin with his cane and this little twisty jump as he stabs at it. It's just really cool. And it's like, wow, he improved very fast from Haven. Like, it's only been like 2 or 3 weeks. Then we don't see him fight again until Volume 7, Chapter 1. See, this is what I mean by we never get to see him fight. And in that one, we get to see him do this really big, cool jump as he poke stabs the Grim. And it one shot kills it. And that plus, you know, kicking off of Cobalt is like all that we get to see him do in that volume. I guess he gets to run at Neo, and then Neo flings him into the air and he catches the relic, which, good job, you caught the relic! Good job, Oscar. I mean, he lost it later too, but that was a cool moment. And then Volume 8, we saw him fight Ironwood, which I'm glad to see that he isn't like suddenly incredible at fighting like after merging or whatever, because I like to see progress. Like, we didn't really get to see him grow much during the training arc. So it's nice to see that he is, you know, still not perfect or anything. Like, Ironwood was able to like just punch him, which, god damn it, can people stop punching the farm boy? I know it's a meme. I know punch the farm boy is a meme, but we need to stop it. Stop hurting him. He's the youngest character. He's only 15. Give him a break. But he can do the cool pokey attack now, which we still don't totally know exactly what it is or what that effect entails, but it might just be showing that they're doing it really fast. I don't know. I will also note that the yell that he does when doing the poke attack, where he's like, ah, like that one, sounds almost exactly like when Ozpin did the pokey attack with Hazel back in Volume 5. It's not exactly the same, and to be fair, their battle cries and screams of pain have always kind of sounded the same, but it's still interesting to note because that's probably on purpose. One mannerism of Oscar's that we've seen Ozpin picking up a couple times is the clench fist thing. Oscar often, when trying to gather courage or when impulsively scared, will clench his hands into fists. And if you've seen any of my reactions, you know that I will comment on it every time that he does it. I will always be like, oh, he does the fist clench he does when he's scared. And I don't mean to do it in that voice every time, but that's essentially how it sounds every time when I watch it back. He did it once before when he was in the snow, when he called Ruby by her first name in Volume 6 and said, "Ruby, please don't." Which, gosh, imagine you're a headmaster and then you die and then you have to go through puberty again and you get all emotional and then everyone yells at you in the snow. So there are a couple things that Oz has picked up from Oscar mannerism-wise, or like stance-wise, etc. And Oscar's posture has just slowly been getting better, but like that one's harder to tell if that's a merge thing or a confidence thing, and I would hazard to say both. But overall, it seems that Oscar is more so picking up the mannerisms from Oz, whereas Oz is picking up facial expressions from Oscar. Those are both in the superficial category, but the substantial category, almost all of it is Ozpin becoming more and more like Oscar. Oscar has held true to his worldview and morals and his development and just all of it. It's interesting that Ozpin has been meeting him where he is. In Chapter 6, when Oscar doesn't want to escape the whale after Ozpin offers to help him get out, and he starts telling him, because Ozpin doesn't know what he's thinking immediately, which is interesting, because he used to seem like he just knew, but now he doesn't, and I'm wondering if that's a conscious choice to be like, I'm going to give Oscar privacy, or if Oscar's able to keep him from reading his thoughts or something, I don't know. But Oscar explains to him that they could try to sabotage Salem from within, and then Ozpin and Oscar at the same time say, maybe we should do the same. I'd have to look back and see if Ozpin's ever said we should do the same before, but I know that Oscar has. But so has Ruby, so it's hard to tell because a lot of the time the dialogue in this show, a lot of characters will use the same words and phrases, and so it's harder to be like, oh, that's a so-and-so thing to say, and sometimes it's just, oh, that's what this writer writes a lot. But regardless, that wasn't like, oh, we're coming to the same idea at the exact same time, as much as it was Oscar had the idea, and then Ozpin met him where he was. And just we certainly are similar, you and I. Like, Ozpin just jumping on board, like, all right, I'll give it a shot. I'm following you now. That's the new dynamic. Just, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but look at these faces. Volume 8 has made Ozpin baby. He's baby now. How did they accomplish that? I'm gonna force myself to stop here because, like I said, this is the last day that I could to do this probably, so I need to start editing. But also I want to make another video because I have an idea for what Oscar's semblance could be and how that could tie into the Wonderland arc, and I think that could be really cool if, you know, they did fall into another world, because it kind of seems like that's what's happening. So I'm gonna stop this one and just record that one, and then hopefully one of them will be made into a video by the time that the day's over. So yeah, maybe Oscar will merge by the end of the volume, maybe he won't. There's a lot of plot points to tie up, so I'm not sure that they're going to do it, or at least be able to do it justice, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. Those were just some of the details that I noticed. If you want to see what I think the merge actually is and how it works, and why Oscar will still be Oscar after the merge, you can check out my video over there. Alrighty, I hope that this was fun. Let me know if you noticed anything else that has been different about them. There's plenty more that I had to say, but I didn't really plan this video before I hit record. So, hope y'all have a swell day, and see you later. Bye-bye!